I had imagined my father's wedding toast 100 different ways. Maybe he would tell a childhood story. Maybe he would welcome Daniel into the family. Maybe, for one evening, he would simply be proud of me. Instead, he lifted his glass, smiled at the crowd, and said, "Anyone who knows Sarah knows she's always been our family's biggest challenge." A few guests laughed politely. I felt my stomach tighten. My father continued, as though he were sharing harmless jokes. He talked about mistakes I had made years earlier. He joked about failed plans, poor decisions, and what he called my talent for disappointing expectations. Each story drew another uncomfortable ripple of laughter. People weren't laughing because they found it funny. They were laughing because they didn't know what else to do. I sat frozen beside Daniel. The reception hall suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. My smile remained in place, but it took everything I had to keep it there. Then my father raised his glass again. "To Sarah," he said, "proof that even the family failure eventually gets lucky." This time, the silence was immediate. Several guests looked down at their tables. Others stared at him in disbelief beside me. Daniel's expression changed from confusion to shock. I could feel every year of criticism returning at once, every comparison, every dismissal, every reminder that I somehow never measured up. My father smiled as though he had delivered the perfect toast. Then, before anyone could speak, movement caught my attention across the room. An elderly man at Daniel's family table slowly pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. The entire room seemed to notice at once. And suddenly, my father's speech was no longer the only thing people were watching anymore today. As the room stared at the elderly man rising from his chair, my mind drifted somewhere else entirely, backward, to all the years that had led to that moment. Growing up, I believed there was a version of myself my father would eventually approve of. I just had to find it. If I brought home good grades, maybe he would be proud. If I worked harder, maybe he would notice. If I stayed out of trouble, made responsible choices, and followed the rules, maybe I would finally earn the praise that seemed to come so easily to everyone else. It never happened. When my brother scored well on an exam, my father called him exceptional. When I earned similar grades, he would say, "That's what you're supposed to do." When my sister received an award, he displayed it for visitors to see. When I achieved something, it was often met with a nod or a brief comment before the conversation moved on. As a child, I didn't understand why. I only knew that approval always seemed one step beyond my reach. Over time, I became skilled at hiding disappointment. I learned not to expect compliments. I learned not to celebrate accomplishments too loudly. Most of all, I learned that seeking validation from my father usually ended the same way, with criticism disguised as advice. "You're smart, but not as focused as your brother. You're capable, but you don't push yourself enough. You're doing fine, but imagine where you'd be if you worked harder." The words changed, the message never did. No matter what I accomplished, there was always something missing. Something inadequate. Something that prevented me from being enough. As the years passed, those small disappointments accumulated into something heavier. Yet, I kept trying. Part of me always believed the next achievement would be different, the next milestone, the next success, the next opportunity to prove myself. When I graduated from college, my father spent more time discussing a cousin's career prospects than my degree. When I earned a promotion at work, he immediately pointed out someone younger, who had advanced faster. When I purchased my first home, he questioned whether it had been a wise investment. Every accomplishment arrived with a qualifier attached. Every victory came with a reminder that someone else had done better. Friends often admired my resilience. What they didn't understand was where it came from. Resilience wasn't something I developed by choice. It was something I built because I needed it. When praise is rare, you learn how to continue without it. When encouragement is inconsistent, you learn how to motivate yourself. When recognition never arrives, you learn how to survive without applause. Eventually, I stopped chasing my father's approval as aggressively as I once had. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. A small part of me never stopped hoping. Even as an adult, even after years of disappointment, even after I met Daniel. Because no matter how old we become, there is something powerful about wanting a parent to look at us and simply say, "I'm proud of you." I spent years waiting to hear those words. Instead, I heard comparisons, corrections, criticism. And somehow, despite everything, I convinced myself that my wedding might finally be different. I didn't realize then that old wounds were about to follow me into one of the most important days of my life. When Daniel proposed, I told myself something I had promised not to believe anymore. Maybe this would be the moment things changed, not dramatically, not overnight. But perhaps a wedding would give my father an opportunity to see me differently. After all, weddings have a way of bringing out emotions people normally keep hidden. They make families reflect. They soften old resentments. At least that was what I hoped. For a few weeks after our engagement, things seemed promising. My father congratulated us. He even smiled during the family dinner where we announced the date. I remember driving home that evening and telling Daniel, "Maybe we're finally turning a corner." Daniel glanced at me and smiled. "I hope so." Looking back, I realize he sounded less convinced than I did. The first cracks appeared during the planning process. It started with small comments when we selected a modest venue. My father questioned whether it was impressive enough. When I chose a simple wedding dress, he suggested that another style would have looked more elegant. When I explained that Daniel and I wanted a smaller guest list, he accused me of excluding important people. Nothing was ever openly hostile. That was what made it so difficult to address. Each criticism arrived disguised as helpful advice. Each comment could be defended as concern. Yet the effect was always the same. No matter what decision I made, it somehow became evidence that I had made the wrong one. One afternoon, while reviewing seating arrangements, my father looked over the guest list and shook his head. "Your sister handled her wedding much better." The words were delivered casually, as though he were discussing the weather, but they landed exactly where they always did. I stared at the papers in front of me. I'm not trying to recreate my sister's wedding. I'm just saying she was more organized. The conversation moved on. The feeling stayed. Months passed. The pattern continued. At tastings, meetings, and family gatherings, comparisons appeared with exhausting consistency. Someone else's choices were better. Someone else's career was more impressive. Someone else's accomplishments deserved greater admiration. Sometimes I wondered whether my father even realized he was doing it. Other times, I suspected he knew exactly what he was doing. Through it all, Daniel remained steady. One evening, after another frustrating family dinner, we sat together in our living room surrounded by wedding paperwork. I finally admitted what I had been feeling. No matter what I do, it's never enough. Daniel set aside the documents and looked at me. "Sarah, do you know what I've noticed?" "What?" "You keep trying to earn something that should have been given freely." I didn't answer. Because deep down, I knew he was right. He reached for my hand. "Your father's opinion isn't the measure of your worth." The words were kind, but years of habit are difficult to overcome. Part of me still wanted approval, still wanted recognition, still wanted one sincere moment where my father looked at me with pride instead of criticism. What I didn't realize was that someone else had begun noticing the situation. Daniel's uncle, Robert. He rarely inserted himself into family matters. As a retired judge and one of the most respected members of Daniel's family, he was known more for listening than speaking. Yet during the months leading up to the wedding, I occasionally caught him watching interactions between my father and me. Not staring. Observing the way a person studies details others overlook. At family gatherings, he noticed who interrupted conversations, who encouraged others, who made people feel welcome, and who made them feel small. Once, after my father criticized a wedding decision for nearly 10 minutes, Uncle Robert quietly changed the subject and asked me about a volunteer project I had been working on. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but afterward, He thanked me for the work. The simple acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized. At the time, I thought little of it. He was simply being kind, or so I believed. I had no way of knowing that Uncle Robert had been paying attention for months. While I searched for approval from one man, another was forming a very different opinion about who I really was. And by the time our wedding reception finally arrived, that quiet observation was about to become impossible for anyone to ignore. The reception had been beautiful up to that point. The ceremony was everything Daniel and I had hoped for. Friends and family filled the room with warmth, laughter, and the kind of happiness that makes a day feel unforgettable. For a while, I allowed myself to relax. I danced with Daniel. I greeted guests. I listened to stories from relatives I hadn't seen in years. Most importantly, I stopped worrying about whether my father approved of anything. For a few precious hours, I was simply enjoying my wedding day. Then came the speeches. The best man went first. His stories were funny and heartfelt. Guests laughed. Daniel laughed. Even I laughed so hard that tears formed in my eyes. Next came my maid of honor. She spoke about friendship, loyalty, and the years we had supported one another through life's challenges. By the time she finished, the room felt warm and emotional. Then the master of ceremonies announced my father's name. A hush settled over the reception hall. I looked toward him as he rose from his chair. Part of me still hoped, despite everything, despite years of disappointment, despite every warning sign. A small part of me believed that when he stood before everyone, he might finally say something kind, something genuine, something a daughter could carry with her for the rest of her life. My father adjusted the microphone, smiled, and began. When Sarah was young, he said, we spent a lot of time wondering what kind of trouble she'd get into next. A few guests laughed politely. I smiled weakly. Perhaps it was just an opening joke. Perhaps something meaningful would follow. It didn't. Instead, he launched into story after story, designed to highlight my mistakes. A failed school project, an embarrassing teenage moment, a business idea that never worked out. Every memory was carefully selected, not to celebrate me, to diminish me. At first, people tried to be good sports. They laughed when laughter seemed expected. But as the speech continued, the mood shifted. The smiles became strained. The laughter grew quieter. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. They were beginning to realize something I already knew. This wasn't affectionate teasing. This wasn't a loving parent sharing humorous memories. This was criticism disguised as entertainment. My father seemed completely unaware, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Each story became more pointed than the last. Sarah always had a way of choosing the difficult path, he said, more nervous laughter. Sometimes we wondered whether she'd ever figure things out. Silence. Then another story. Another joke. Another reminder of every flaw he believed I possessed. I stared at my hands beneath the table. The room around me seemed distant. Every sentence felt strangely familiar because I had been hearing versions of them my entire life. The difference was that now hundreds of people were hearing them too. Across the table, Daniel's expression had changed. The easy smile he had worn throughout the evening was gone. He looked stunned, confused, then angry. His hand found mine beneath the table. He squeezed gently, not enough to draw attention, just enough to remind me that I wasn't alone. I appreciated the gesture more than I could explain, because in that moment, I felt 12 years old again. A little girl sitting at a dinner table, hoping for praise and receiving criticism instead. The years disappeared. The hurt remained. My father continued speaking. Guests stopped laughing altogether. A few people lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The reception hall had become painfully quiet. Yet he pressed on, completely committed to the performance. Finally, he raised his glass. The room waited. Perhaps he would end on a positive note. Perhaps, after all the jokes, he would offer a heartfelt conclusion. Instead, he smiled and said, "To Sarah, proof that even the family failure eventually gets lucky." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No laughter followed, no applause, nothing. The silence was immediate and absolute. I felt every face in the room, every ounce of embarrassment, every old wound reopening at once. My father seemed pleased with himself, as though he had delivered a memorable toast. In a way, he had, just not for the reasons he imagined. Then something unexpected happened. A chair scraped softly against the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. People turned. I turned. At Daniel's family table, Uncle Robert was slowly rising to his feet. The retired judge stood with deliberate calm. His expression revealed very little. But something about his posture instantly commanded attention. The room fell even quieter. My father lowered his glass. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed his face. Uncle Robert waited until every eye in the reception hall was on him. Then he looked toward the head table and politely asked if he might say a few words. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence hanging over the reception hall felt almost physical. My father still stood near the microphone, holding his glass. The confidence that had carried him through his speech seemed less certain now. Uncle Robert waited patiently. He wasn't a man who demanded attention. He simply received it. After more than 30 years as a judge and decades as a respected community leader, he possessed the rare ability to command a room without raising his voice. The master of ceremonies nodded and handed him the microphone. Uncle Robert smiled politely. "Thank you." He looked around the room before speaking again. "I wasn't planning to give a speech tonight." A few guests exchanged curious glances. "However," he continued, "after listening to what was just said, I feel there are a few things worth mentioning." My stomach tightened. I had no idea where this was going. Neither did anyone else. Uncle Robert turned toward Daniel and me. "I've had the privilege of knowing Sarah for several years now." His voice remained calm and measured. "Not a lifetime, not since childhood, just long enough to observe who she is when she believes nobody is paying attention." The room listened carefully. "Character reveals itself in ordinary moments," he said. "Not during speeches, not during celebrations, in everyday life." Something in his tone made people sit a little straighter. Then he began sharing stories, not dramatic stories, not extraordinary accomplishments, simple moments. He talked about a charity fundraiser where volunteers had failed to appear at the last minute. Sarah stayed 6 additional hours to help. He talked about an elderly neighbor recovering from surgery. Sarah delivered meals for weeks without mentioning it to anyone. He described a family gathering where a nervous teenager had spent most of the evening sitting alone. Sarah noticed. Sarah included her. Sarah made her feel welcome. As he spoke, I felt heat rise into my face. I had forgotten some of those moments. Others seemed too insignificant to remember. Yet Uncle Robert remembered them all. The room grew quieter with every example. Not because the stories were dramatic, because they revealed something deeper. The kind of person someone chooses to be when no reward is expected. "The thing I've noticed about Sarah," he continued, "is that she consistently makes life easier for the people around her." Several guests nodded. Daniel smiled softly beside me. Uncle Robert wasn't finished. He spoke about patience, kindness, reliability, integrity, qualities that rarely attract attention in a world obsessed with achievements and appearances. Then he looked directly toward my father. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Success means different things to different people," he said carefully. "I've met wealthy people who lacked character and ordinary people whose integrity made them extraordinary." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The words settled heavily across the room. "For months, I've watched Sarah plan this wedding." His gaze shifted back toward me. "I've seen how she treats vendors, friends, family members, and complete strangers." A gentle smile crossed his face. "And I can honestly say that Daniel is not the lucky one because he found a perfect woman." The room remained silent. "He's lucky because he found a good one." Something inside me broke. Not painfully. Relief. Years of it. Years spent measuring myself against impossible standards. Years spent wondering why I was never enough. And now a man with no obligation to defend me was describing qualities I had spent most of my life believing nobody noticed. Around the room, expressions were changing. Guests who had listened uncomfortably to my father's speech were now seeing a completely different picture. Not the daughter who disappointed expectations, the woman who quietly exceeded them. For the first time all evening, my father looked genuinely uncomfortable. His eyes shifted around the room. He could feel it too. The narrative he had built was slipping away because Uncle Robert wasn't speaking from emotion. He was speaking from observation. And people trusted him. Yet, as powerful as his words had already been, he wasn't finished. He glanced around the room one final time. Then he prepared to share something that would change the atmosphere completely. Uncle Robert paused for a moment, allowing his previous words to settle across the room. Then he smiled. "There is one more thing I'd like everyone here to know." The reception hall remained silent. Even the servers moving between tables seemed to stop. Uncle Robert rested one hand lightly on the microphone. For the last several years, Daniel's family has had countless conversations about Sarah. I looked up in surprise. I had no idea what he was about to say. A few members of Daniel's family were already smiling, the kind of smile people wear when they know a truth that is finally about to be spoken aloud. Uncle Robert continued. Whenever Sarah wasn't in the room, the conversation was remarkably consistent. A few quiet laughs spread through the crowd. We talked about how thoughtful she is. More smiles appeared. How dependable she is. My eyes began to sting. How she remembers birthdays, checks on people when they're struggling, and somehow notices when someone needs encouragement before anyone else does. Several heads nodded. Daniel's mother wiped at her eyes. His father smiled proudly. The room was no longer looking at me with sympathy. They were looking at me with respect. Uncle Robert glanced toward Daniel. Our family has never worried about whether Sarah was good enough for Daniel. A soft ripple of emotion moved through the room. The truth is, we've spent years telling Daniel how fortunate he is to have her. The words hit me harder than anything else that evening. For so long, I had focused on one person's opinion that I never fully recognized how many others already valued me. Applause began slowly one table, then another. Soon, the entire reception hall was clapping. Some guests stood, others brushed away tears. The sound filled every corner of the room. Across the hall, my father's version of me quietly collapsed beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer control. And as the applause continued, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in my life, I no longer needed his approval. Long after the applause faded, and the reception returned to laughter, music, and celebration, I found myself standing alone on a quiet balcony outside the hall. The evening air was cool. Inside, guests were dancing. Through the windows, I could see Daniel talking with friends and family, smiling in a way that always made me feel safe. Yet my thoughts remained fixed on what had happened. For years, I believed there was something missing in me, some quality I lacked, some achievement I had failed to reach. I spent so much energy chasing my father's approval that I rarely stopped to ask whether it was mine to earn in the first place. The answer came unexpectedly on my wedding day, not from my father, from someone who had no obligation to defend me. Uncle Robert's words had given me something I didn't realize I needed: perspective. He saw value in qualities my father had ignored: patience, kindness, loyalty, character, and, perhaps most importantly, he reminded me that worth is not determined by the opinions of people who refuse to see it. A moment later, Daniel stepped onto the balcony and slipped his arm around my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked softly. I smiled. For the first time that day, the answer came easily. Yes, and I meant it, because I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. The people who recognize our worth most clearly are often the ones who have no reason to praise us at all. And somehow, that recognition means the most.